Week number one with no football. I was talking to a friend of mine who's like, how are you coping? And I was like, well,
Yeah.
I have
How
a
you holding up?
I have a 3-leg parlay on the Blackhawks tonight, so not great. Not Hey,
Well, hey,
Bedard's back. Bedard's back
that
just in time.
speaking of which, I even texted it to you. My cousin Brendan
Oh yeah,
texted me. He put $1 bet on an 11-leg parlay, all
on the NHL.
NHL, and it hit. It had like 100,000 to 1 odds or what,
Yeah,
something
and
like
he
that.
hit.
Like just a crazy odds. So yeah, he won a nice chunk of change.
Yeah.
Um,
I have like it's like a $5 Bedard over 3 shots on goal. The Blackhawks over 1.5 goals, and then Blackhawks it's like Blackhawks money line win against Carolina. I'm just riding the Bedard's back. They're hot. They're on a 1-game win streak since Bedard's back.
yeah, right.
Carolina's very good. Carolina's very good, and the Hawks are on the road. But so that's where I'm at. Also, I was violently frustrated yesterday when NASCAR was postponed. We have a sharp out here so I can get home to watch the Daytona 500 in an hour and 28 minutes from now. I got money on my guy Brad Keselowski, RFK Racing. So I'm hanging in there. The Genesis Open this weekend was good golf. Hideki Matsuyama is one of my like 4 guys in golf that I routinely root for and bet. He's been one of my favorites since he won that Masters a couple years ago. He's just fantastic, and he's like the most prototype, just like Japanese dude of all time. It was very, like a very, 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 when his caddy bows to the course and, kind of like a little thicker than your normal, like, guy, Asian guy. He's awesome. Yeah. He's great. So I like that's, I'm coping. I'm dealing. It's not great.
As best as you can, that's just how it works.
We have a lot, like now it's like within the next week and a half, we're going to get we have some really exciting stuff. Like we have Big East tournament, Big Ten tournament starting the next, like UConn's wagon. I'm all in on UConn. I'm out on Purdue. Purdue sucks. And so there's things to keep me fired up. There's things to keep me going.
Yeah. And a shout out to my brother-in-law, Mason, as well, who works for Era Motorsports. They won the Rolex 500 at Daytona. They raced for IMSA.
Nice.
And that team won a couple weeks ago at this point. So shout out there. But yeah, cool. A lot of other sports happening right now for sure. And we're, a couple of weeks away. We're already in spring training, but we're a couple of weeks away from, the start of baseball season too. So it's wild how quickly things roll along. But as I was telling my wife, Grace, last week, she's like, what are you going to do now that football season's over? And I was like,
we're going to talk football.
Football season is never over. Okay. You need to understand this is football season's a 24/7, 365 deal. You have much to learn.
How funny you are, honey.
Yeah. Oh man. Great stuff. Well, we're going to get into it. The week has passed since the Super Bowl. So we've got a couple things to talk about there to kind of clean up and wrap up all of the Super Bowl talk, get ready for the 2024 NFL season. And we're going to discuss on this episode the main storylines, the top 3 takeaways that each of us had from the season. And then we'll dive into some other league news and notes as we wrap up the show today. But let's get into it. Our post-Super Bowl first episode of the 2024 season is upon us now. All right, we're diving into the content here. Football Lounge with Mark and Dan, brought to you by the For Frequency's Sake Podcast Network. Please check us out and all the other shows as well as we dive into a lot of other sports seasons here. We've got plenty of great content from betting anything to racing, baseball, basketball, all of that good stuff. So please check us out.
I got to get on the gambling show. They got to get me on.
Yeah, man. Yeah, they churn out a lot of content. So that'd be cool. Get you on one of those shows, and always fun to work with the guys here at the For Frequency's Sake Podcast Network. So, Mark, we'll put a bow on the 2023 NFL season with just some, final takeaways, anything that's come up as we've kind of had a week to digest the Chiefs' victory, the back-to-back champion performance by Kansas City, and also the 49ers firing their defensive coordinator, Steve Wilks, as well. So we'll talk about that, but I'll toss it to you for any just initial thoughts here as we've had a little bit of time to think back.
Yeah, for me, I keep going back to the fact that I was expecting, Monday we did our show, and then I was expecting throughout the week for more of the national media to like pick up the narrative that I was picking up, and I felt like no one did. And then I got really frustrated. I'm like, are we as a media kind of protecting Kyle Shanahan? And then Wilks gets fired, and you start to see a little bit more criticism of Shanahan. I'm just wondering where more of the criticism of Kyle Shanahan is. Like, what? Like, I keep looking back at the game and those drives to start the third quarter. I mean, you're up 10-3. You get an interception. You go 3 and out. You force then a 3 and out. You go 3 and out. And then Chiefs put a drive together, field goal 10-6. And you can't even get anything going there. You go 3 and out. I mean, 3 and outs to start the third quarter. It's just brutal. And then the play calling, it baffles me even more when I look back, and I was watching some different like highlights through the fourth quarter. That 3rd and 5 after the 2-minute warning, when they chose to basically say, if we don't get it, we're kicking the field goal. Like my co-host Sam, she's not a diehard football person. She's just a mom in her 40s. Like, she's, like most people, likes football, knows it, but and she says, like, I just can't believe teams give the ball back to Mahomes. And it seems so simple.
It really is that simple. Yeah.
Kyle
really
Shanahan had an opportunity to not give the ball back to Patrick Mahomes. You're tied. The game's tied. Like, you have a chance to not give the ball back to him. 3rd and 5, post 2-minute warning. If you run the ball with Christian McCaffrey there and you pick up 2 or 3 yards, you're at 4th and 2, 4th and 1. Like, you got to go for it. Like, there's no aggressiveness from Kyle Shanahan and his staff. And then that sits even more poorly with me than you fire Steve Wilks, where it's like, you were not aggressive. Your strength of your team was your offense and your weapons, and you weren't aggressive in the big moments, and you didn't stick with your identity in the start of the third quarter. So that's really what's lingering for me more is, yeah, Patrick Mahomes was amazing, and it felt like maybe he would have found a way to win that game anyways, unless the Chiefs had converted that 3rd and 5. The game, they could have milked the clock to kick the field goal with like 2 seconds left and win 19-16, and the game is over. It's just not sitting well with me that Shanahan isn't getting more criticism for how that game, the start of the third quarter, and how that big 3rd and 5 were handled post 2-minute warning. Everyone was focusing so much on the overtime. It shouldn't even got to overtime. Kyle Shanahan just really, to me, that's the biggest takeaway. I keep looking back. I'm like, he had a really bad day day for an otherwise really good coach.
I think, I've come to the realization over the last several years, especially as head coaches have become more in high demand, if they are schematic focused, if they are young, up and coming. I think that I've kind of started to notice a little bit of a trend, and I'm not, saddling Kyle Shanahan with this specifically, or, Dan Campbell, who I'll reference here in a moment either. But there are a lot of different styles of coaching. But if we break it down into like 2 general camps, there's, the heavy schematics one, and then there's the much more like leader of men, rah-rah, emotional leadership type of thing. And both have their place in the sport, and both are needed. I think both of those archetypes also suffer from roughly the same thing, and that's their own hubris, their own pride, getting in the way and presenting a blind spot to where they're not able to overcome or at least change things fast enough. And so the best coaches really are the ones that have that self-awareness of, I think McVay does this very well. And to Shanahan's credit, I think he's done it well in the past. And I've heard people talk about this in relation to Steve Wilks too, where Shanahan has surrounded himself with guys who are more maybe in the Dan Campbell mold, because he's not like that. And he realizes maybe the team needs to offset that a little bit with some of that leadership. but I will say, from the Kyle Shanahan mold, you run the risk of being too smart for your own good and relying too heavily on your own, assessment of things to not maybe take a step back and get a look at the big picture. And that's hard to do when you're in the moment. I get that. But, those are moments in the game where maybe he felt like, oh, it's all about the odds right now and what's in my favor without taking into account the temperature of the situation, the momentum that is being developed, the stage you're on, all of those things play into a factor, and then the opposite side, obviously, the rah-rah cheerleader, great leader, CEO type head coaches, can often think that their, emotional investment in developing players can overcome any schematic downfalls. And a lot of times it just can't. You need to get those smarter guys in the room. So, I think a lot of that can play into it. And yeah, I mean, I agree. I think Kyle Shanahan perhaps was a victim of that in this game, in which he felt he had a game plan. He was going to stick to it and it was going to work. And no matter, what their situation was, they were going to be steadfast. But, sometimes you do have to pivot. And sometimes, coaches and players are rewarded for, meeting the moment rather than just looking on the sheet and saying, well, what did this call for when we drew it up, back in the room. So
yeah, and Steve Wilkes getting fired, I think I agree. I think, from my standpoint, it does make sense to where if he's just not right for your room after spending a year with him. And again, they've had a lot of turnover. They went from Saleh to D'Amico, and now they're on their third one in his 5-year span here of like making 2 Super Bowls. There's a lot of turnover for, again, an offensive guy. We give we get a lot of knock to defensive coaches who can't figure the offense out. Shanahan's an offensive coach who's got his defense figured out, partially because of a great thing from John Lynch is really figuring out that defense, and the GM is just putting together such a collection of talent that it feels like anyone can go in there and coach those guys.
And this also does speak to Kyle Shanahan's ability to, because I know he's getting a lot of flack for firing Steve Wilkes, and I get that. But I mean, to your point, he's done really well 3 defensive coordinators in a row. At this point, we almost feel like he's just really good at hiring staffs, and so you got to feel confident that he can figure it out again, And
it definitely feels like this is the type of firing that it's like it just didn't work out the way we wanted it to. The room, how we felt, how we meshed philosophy wise, it just didn't, I guess, feel like it went right. Because if it's a scapegoat hire, it doesn't feel like it's a scapegoat firing because neither Shanahan nor Lynch's jobs are, on the line. Like if they like him, if they like Wilkes and they just didn't love the way he called the game, it's not like they have to fire someone or else the owner's coming in there going, you guys better fire for someone or you're out. Like it just not. So it definitely feels like, okay, maybe even they were going to fire him no matter what. And remember, San Francisco was really bad defensively against Green Bay and Detroit. They locked it down at moments, but they were bad. And then they had a really nice Super Bowl against Mahomes. But in the end, you could tell in that last couple drives in the fourth quarter and overtime, if Mahomes was going to score, he was going to score. Yeah. I think just going back to my final look back on the Super Bowl will be, the Chiefs felt 100% more prepared for the big moments, and the Niners, the box score just is so ugly. Kittle, 2 catches, 4 yards. Debo, 3 catches on 11 targets. McCaffrey's first run in the third quarter was on the third drive on a 1st and 10 after not giving him the ball for 2 straight drives. And it felt like, oh, now we have to panic after they kick a field goal. We got to get it to Christian McCaffrey. And it comes up with a predictable run for -1 yard. I just think this one will stick with me really a long time. And remembering if San Francisco gets back to these big moments, that Shanahan has really got to prove that he doesn't turtle and he doesn't panic, because he put the ball in Brock Purdy's hands. Now, granted, if Brock Purdy makes the plays, then Shanahan looks like a genius. But he didn't make the plays. Brock Purdy didn't make the plays. They weren't good enough. He wasn't special enough. So it makes me really question Shanahan. Why did you even put the ball in his hands? And why didn't you just in a tight game when you, especially after an interception, all these things like you just got to go back to what got you there, and they didn't do it. And it's gonna, it's sitting with me. I was rooting for the Chiefs and had picked the Chiefs. It's the loss. It just doesn't sit well with me for the Niners. I can only imagine Niners fans probably are stewing over it, and we may have to get on the show this offseason a Niners, kind of beat writer expert just to kind of pick their brains about what the state of the fan base and the franchise is going into the year, depending on what they do in the draft and some things, and new defensive coordinator, because it does feel like at this point in time, what do they got to do as a franchise to get over the hump? 0-3 in their last 3 Super Bowls, haven't won one since 94, coming up on 30 years. Mm-hmm. They've been a really good franchise, really solid franchise with some down years, lean years in the early 2000s, and then they're post Harbaugh for a while. But otherwise, it just feels like they can't get it done. They're a little bit cursed. We make fun of the Cowboys all the time for having not won one. Yeah. The Niners, maybe they deserve less criticism because they've gotten there, but they haven't won jack since, Steve Young.
Exactly. No, and I was going to, go right into that. So it's a perfect segue because, I brought it up before, but, those fan bases and those franchises almost are in a position where you can't win either way with the rest of the NFL, because you're going to have the franchises who never get to the NFC, AFC championship games, never get to the Super Bowl. And they're going to say, oh, 49ers, you're so spoiled. You've had a great team. But at the same time, they've gone 30 years
if you're
without
our
seeing
age,
their team win a championship. And also, exactly. If you're our age, you haven't seen it. And
you saw one, but you were a baby. And then you've seen 3 really brutal Super Bowl losses.
Yeah, and in some ways that can be even more torturous and more brutal than not really having any expectations season after season. Yeah. That's more of a fatigue thing than it is, getting your hopes up to constantly have them, cut out from underneath you. The Packers are a similar way. The Cowboys you mentioned, Steelers are in that, 12-year, not really having much success for that long too. So yeah, it's just, that's why I pushed back when people were saying this was a same old Super Bowl story. I'm like, not really. The 49ers are still fighting to get that trophy again. So it's just a reminder, that it's really hard to win it. And even if you're a good franchise and do all of the right things, it's still the Super Bowl, and it's still difficult to get there. But we will get into our top storylines for the 2023 NFL season next, right after a word from the rest of the shows here on the For Frequency's Sake Podcast Network.
For Frequency's Sake has you covered on all things sports. From the squared circle to the hardwood and the gridiron to the speedway, we've got something for everyone. Walk down the aisle with the boys from Cards Subject to Change every Sunday as they take a deep dive into everything pro wrestling. Need your gambling fix? We've got you there. Enter Pit Row with Rod Villagomez and Fast Money as we win the checkered flag with NASCAR, Xfinity, and truck race winners and props. Football more your style? Explore the waters of NFL DFS with DFS Deep Dive with Brian Craighead and Jordan Kernan each week. More into the science portion of the game? We've got a double dose of action there. The Professor John Bush and Dennis Michelson take you into their science lab and dissect your week in the data lab. Want an analytical take? Nick Gurl and the team at Gridiron AI come to you each week with The Lab. Need to know who to start last minute? The network's flagship show, For Fantasy's Sake, is here in a pinch. The fellas come to you live every football Sunday from 10 to 11:30 Central with the week's best DFS, gambling, and lineup advice. And wrap up your Sundays with Joe Winkle and Nick Brinks as they come to you live with educated ignorance looking at all the day's action. Can't get enough of Joe? He comes to you 3 times a week. Not enough football on Sunday? Not a problem. Kick your feet up at lunch on Monday and slip on into the Football Lounge with Mark and Dan while they look at the week that was in news, notes, and more. For Frequency's Sake, you know what we mean.
All right, welcome back to the show. And as promised, we're going to go over our top 3 storylines of the 2023 NFL season, touching on some of the biggest topics that we think we will take away from this year. Looking maybe even a decade into the future, how are we going to look back on the season that was? So it was an interesting one, Mark. I think there were a lot of storylines to pull from and a lot of different ways we could have gone with this. So I'd imagine there might be one overlap here on our list together, but I'm sure there'll be some variety in here too, given the magnitude of different changes and circumstances that did befall the NFL season. So I'll toss it to you for your first first storyline to throw out here, and we'll go back and forth until we get all of our set out there.
We haven't done this in years past, but I think it might be a new tradition for us in the kind of the week after the Super Bowl, because I think the cool thing about this idea is if you ask any different football fan, there are things like this. This is going to be a million different answers for the most part of like, what are they going to remember the most from this year? The storylines, the things that land with you. I could have done a whole list of just Bears things, but believe it or not, the Chicago Bears didn't make my list. And I think part of that is I didn't want to force it. The Bears always be, important to me, but I think this year was really forgettable for a lot of the season until there was kind of a late push, and then that Browns loss really killed a lot of the momentum for me. But Bears topics, honorable mention, obviously. Tyson Bagent wasn't gonna crack the top three. So I'll start at number 3, and then I'll toss it to you for your number 3. And to me, it was the Detroit Lions. Like, I'll remember this year always as the year that I truly, truly believed for the first time in my life, without just it being willful ignorance. Like the stats, the rosters, everything showed they're the best team in the NFC, and they should be in a Super Bowl. And it started with that Week 1 win. I mean, so much of it was when they announced almost a year ago, the Lions will play, the Chiefs on opening night. And we're like, the Lions? And a lot of it then, it just came to fruition. We almost had a Lions-Chiefs Super Bowl. And being able to root for them, they were so fun, so electric, such a good team. Now, next year, I think the Lions are still going to be very good, but they're going to be less of that lovable loser and a little bit more like, damn, the Lions are really good. And this is kind of, all right, okay, yeah, I get it. And if they get to the point where they're in an NFC Championship game against the Niners, I feel probably like I'll root for them again, because they'll be in that moment where you're rooting for them. But you never forget your first. You never forget your first watching the Lions in an NFC Championship game. And for us, this is our first. This is our first time seeing the Lions in an NFC title game as football fans. And I think they were just such a feel-good story throughout the year. A couple up and down moments, that weird loss to the Seahawks, getting blown out by the Ravens, the controversial loss against Dallas that really, in the end screwed them, because they would have had a chance still at the number 1 seed. That game could have been played in Detroit. And I certainly think if you look at how close the game was in San Francisco, if that game was in Detroit, you're talking about maybe a different outcome for who made it into the Super Bowl. Dan Campbell really coming into his own as a legitimate head coach in the NFL and not a complete flash in the pan. So the Lions, to me, are very deserving of being in my top 3 of the things I'll remember most from the 2023 NFL season.
Yeah, I didn't rank mine. I just listed the 3. I did have the Lions on there, and I probably, if I were to rank them out, probably would have had the Lions number 2 on my list there. In full agreement, it's kind of hard to think about this year without the Lions being front and center in a lot of ways, because throughout the entire regular season, not only were they, just performing extremely well and in play for the 1 seed for a good portion of the year, and just kind of seeing the progression of the Dan Campbell era improve each year, kind of coming to a climax this season in many ways. At the same time, there were a couple other notable things that occurred this year that maybe took center stage. And if the Lions got to the Super Bowl, I think regardless of if they won, the Lions would have been the number 1 story.
Yeah.
But they're almost there just for what they did, this season, snapping that, I think, 32-year playoff losing streak, getting to the NFC Championship game, bringing, life back to the city of Detroit, and more hope for Detroit fans is something they haven't had for decades upon decades. And, despite that small window with Barry Sanders, there was a lot of, turmoil before then as well. So to be able to get to a point where they feel they have a stable organization, and not only to mention that, but the team performed well. But I'll remember the Lions for also the draft class that they were able to put together.
Yeah.
I mean, getting the amazing production out of Jack Campbell and, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs, and the safety out of Alabama. Like they had a lot of productivity from rookies early on, and they weren't just good, but they were Pro Bowl worthy players in many ways, and some breaking records too in Laporta's case. So it was just an impressive year for that franchise all around, and they were that team that didn't really have any haters unless you were playing against them, because they were kind of America's team this year in terms of just the one group that everyone could rally around, likable personalities and a likable team and city as well. So yeah, I definitely had the Detroit Lions on there. So if I were to go maybe then to my what I would put as my number 3 most likely would be the year of the backup quarterbacks. To me, this is, growing up, I used to watch a lot of those America's Game Super Bowl recap type shows. And there was one with a DVD box set where they recapped the whole season leading up to the Super Bowl and then do the Super Bowl too. If I were to watch one of those, I don't think they make them anymore. If I were to watch one of those for this year, I could just tell that the opening monologue from the narrator would be, it was the year of the backup quarterback. And then you just see Joe Flacco slinging it. And
Tommy DeVito.
Man, exactly.
Tyson Badgett.
The man off the couch leading his team to victory. The mustached Minshew coming through and bringing his team to relevance despite a rookie of the year in the same division.
Mason Rudolph.
Mason Rudolph. We had insert Jets quarterback here. You had Joshua Dobbs, who I know.
Josh Dobbs.
Dobbs was a starter, but
technically
he's the backup guy. Case Keenum played a football game this year. Aiden O'Connell. Carson Wentz beat the 49ers this year. It's
wild year.
What a crazy year of backup quarterbacks and injuries in particular. And I this might be a cop-out, but I kind of tie in the memorable aspect of that being that Aaron Rodgers got injured on the very first drive of his tenure with, the Jets. So yeah, quarterback injuries and backups, Jake Browning, a lot of good production from the backup quarterback position at that. Very fascinating year from that indeed. And I believe it was the third most starting quarterbacks in NFL history, I believe is what the stat was. So it's only happened a few times in history. This many quarterbacks have played a football game. And it's just, you can't tell the story without some of that, including you have the comeback player of the year and Flacco being one of those.
Yeah, that's a great point. My number 2 is a more specific quarterback look, but that's a great point. I really love that year of the backup quarterback. Mine is Bryce versus CJ. Bryce Young, CJ Stroud. I'll always, rookie quarterbacks, you always think to their rookie year. And remember, you had things like, especially when you take guys that high, and CJ Stroud was taken number 2 overall, and you have, a 1-2 punch, and you look at guys like Mariota and Winston, both fairly successful rookie years. You look at guys like Andrew Luck and RG3. RG3 won Rookie of the Year, and Andrew Luck won 11 games and, led his team to the playoffs. So, usually that 1-2, there's a lot to like and a lot to compare. And this was such a disaster of a year for Bryce Young and such a rocket ship and an unexpected rocket ship of a year for CJ Stroud. It is a monumental 1-2 swap like I don't think there's ever been in NFL history that I can remember, where you have the top 2
maybe
guys.
Ryan Leaf and Manning, right?
Yeah, but Manning's rookie year wasn't great. You know what I mean?
That's
I'm just
true.
talking about
That's
that
true.
rookie year.
Fair enough.
In just
Fair
that,
enough. Yeah.
wow. We knew by week 2, week 3, this was a massive miss from Carolina.
That's true.
And a gigantic win for the Houston Texans. And what's great about it is that sophomore slumps are real. We know it. It's just there's something about it. It's the defensive coordinators are good. They get tape. Guys, you know what I mean? There's a little bit of that almost fatigue. You don't catch people by surprise. And it'll be really fascinating to see if that storyline can turn around. You'll always be able to compare the two. You always compare the quarterbacks taking Mitch and and Mahomes. You know what I mean? Mitch gets released last week by the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I'm still seeing tweets about Mahomes and the Bears and Mitch and blah, blah, blah. It's like, this will be CJ Stroud and Bryce Young for the rest of their careers. If Bryce Young balls out next year, plays really, really well, and CJ has a little bit of a sophomore slump, it'll be part of the storyline will be their rookie years and how, we were all burying, Bryce Young and crowning CJ Stroud. And now CJ Stroud is out giving Amber Rose a ride home, and look out, careful. You know what I mean? Hang out with the Kardashians at their box at the Super Bowl. It's very, that fame and that fortune and that Pro Bowl mentality can go to a head quickly. So to me, it was a fascinating year between the two, with just how ugly it got for Bryce Young and how great it was for CJ Stroud. It sets up a really fascinating, not only trajectory for their careers, but a really fascinating year 2 for them and these guys. And so I'll always look back at the 2023 season for that. And part of that is, again, my Bears story, rooting for the Panthers to be bad and realizing, they're like really, really bad, was just it was an integral part of the 2023 season for me as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good call because, it is something where we're going to look back and be like, oh yeah, even if we don't remember 2023 was the year that CJ Stroud and Bryce Young were drafted. And the second you find out, that was their rookie year, like you instantly remember, okay, the Texans, I remember that year because the Texans went from completely irrelevant to playing in a playoff game,
winning a playoff game,
and having the offensive rookie of the year and the defensive rookie of the year for one of a handful of times in NFL history that's happened, and the draft class and DeMeco Ryans, and they'll just all come flooding back. And yeah, I mean, CJ Stroud will obviously dominate that when you're thinking of 2023, and yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, we've talked about it. Next year and the year after are going to be really interesting to think about these young quarterbacks and see what the AFC South is truly made of. We kind of got robbed of that with Anthony Richardson getting hurt, but man, Richardson, Stroud, Lawrence, and Levis, if he can, create some of the magic that he was able to spark a few times during his starts, what a wild division that'll be of a lot of young quarterbacks. So it was definitely a good call. My final one, and I know it's, kind of boring at this point because it's talked about a lot, but I will remember 2023 for being the year that Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs solidified their dynasty, made themselves back-to-back champs, and that it was the year that Patrick Mahomes, dismissed any questions about his ability to come in the clutch on the road against the best, because he did it back-to-back games in the divisional round and the championship against the MVP and against Josh Allen. To me, it's too memorable to leave off of a list like this, even if it's cliche. There's something to be said for that run. We remember the 2020 or the 2012 Joe Flacco playoff run because Joe Flacco isn't a Hall of Fame quarterback. And we're like, look, but that 2012 year, he went on the road and just dominated in the postseason. But I'm going to think about this year and be like, man, Patrick Mahomes not only played well, but really, really dominated in many facets of the game in the most hostile of environments against the league's best to get his team to that dynasty, mountaintop. And it culminated in like the perfect story for Kansas City. And so that's what it makes me think of for sure.
Yeah. My year, my number one is it's the year of the Swift, Taylor Swift.
There you go. Okay.
And I tie it into with the Chiefs, but to me, sure. I wrote it here, year of the Swift, must be the season of the Swift. To me, I'll never forget sitting there watching the Bears game and my wife and Eva coming in like, oh my God, there she is. Like that game against the Bears Chiefs. And it was real. And it was, we talked about like, there's Travis Kelce's just messing around, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. He's just playing. And I was like, there's just no way. It's not real. Like, it's not real. And then seeing her there And watching my Bears lose like 44-0, it was, it wasn't that. But they were getting, I think at one point in time it was close to 40-0. I don't remember the exact score. But you were captivated by Taylor Swift, the biggest superstar on the planet, was there. And because of Travis Kelce, watching them walk out of the stadium and going on Twitter and seeing that video and being like, oh my God, they're driving off in his convertible together. Like, holy crap, he's doing it. And then for it to be like, is she going to be at MetLife? She's going to be at MetLife. I think she's going to MetLife next week. And then she was in Minnesota. And then it's like Green Bay. It's like, holy crap. And for it to tie in then with the run the Chiefs win on, and having that as a moment, 2023 will be the year that, to me, the Chiefs and Taylor Swift, may all, like, you will look back at it maybe in 10 years from now with how big the game is and how the growth of it. You could say like that was a, not a defining moment, but that was a turbo boost, a nitrous oxide to the growth of football in America because of her involvement, especially if they go on to, get engaged or get married and Travis keeps playing while they're doing that. If he plays another couple years, it will just continue to add jet fuel to fire. And it all started in the 2023 season when I'll never forget Barstool Big Cat said it best. The Bears after that loss were 0-4. And it's like, the Bears are officially you invite your girlfriend to this game. Like, oh, we're going to put on a show. We could beat up. Like that was the Bears were the bad team that you're like, no, babe, come to this game. It'll be great. Like I promise. You don't want to come to the Lions game week 1. I'm gonna nick my knee up. You don't want to come out to Bears week 4. Come on down to Arrowhead. It'll be a lot of fun. Yeah. Put on a show. So to me, you combine Taylor Swift with the run the Chiefs had, that will always be 2023 in the memory of this season for me.
It was 41-10, by the way.
41-10.
In case you were wondering. Yeah, that was the final there. No, it was a great call. Great call. Because
bear down.
I'm sure there's nobody more happy to call it the year of Taylor Swift than the NFL and Roger Goodell, because millions upon millions of new viewers, and I'm sure plenty of more merch sold as well. So they've got to be happy about all of that too. And yeah, it was definitely the year of T Swift, no question. All right. For our last segment here on the show, Mark, we'll kind of talk about some news and notes around the league, because starting tomorrow, Tuesday, through Tuesday, March 5th, NFL teams will be able to designate the franchise or transition tag on their selective players.
Yeah.
Some notable candidates are Saquon Barkley, linebacker Josh Allen, Brian Burns, Josh Jacobs, T. Higgins, Jalen Johnson of the Bears there, Michael Pittman, Baker Mayfield, Christian Wilkins, a lot of candidates here this year. And yeah, there's that short windows, about 15 days or so for NFL teams to really make a determining factor, or a decision, I should say, on what the determining factor is for the transition or the franchise tag. A quick refresher for anyone who may need to be brushed up on it. The franchise tag is it's a guarantee that you will get to have that player the next year for a fully guaranteed contract for 1 year. And it is a worth the average of the top 5 players at that position. So whoever the top 5 running backs are making, you take the average, and that is what it costs to franchise tag Saquon Barkley, for instance. Transition tag, there's a lot of nuances to all of this, but basically what it means is they, put an initial tag on a player, but the player can still seek out a contract elsewhere. It just means that if they get a contract from another team, the team that placed the tag on them has an opportunity to match that offer and get to have that player for the next year themselves. So that's what these candidates are going to be looking forward to over the next 15 days with their agents, and figure out what the best route is. And obviously, if they get tagged, there's nothing they can do about it. But it'll be interesting to see. I mean, of this list, Adam Schefter tweeted out, many of the notables here. Are there any where you're like, these guys got to be franchise tagged? And are there others where you're like, definitely do not franchise tag those guys? Let them get their money elsewhere and see what the market holds.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is to me, it brings up, again, the point we talked a lot about last year with like a guy like Saquon and Josh Jacobs. Neither of them ended up signing a tag. They signed like 1-year deals for a little bit more money than the tag, and then there was like incentives. But what they've done is they kind of put themselves in a tough spot because it allows them
tagged now. Yeah.
This year, where if you get tagged, I guess I'd have to really look at all the financials with my agent, whatever, I was in that spot. But if you get tagged 1 year, it benefits you in the sense that the next year, if they tag you, like they could have tagged Saquon for a second year, but it like almost like doubles the price, right? Like it goes up, I think 50% exponentially, and it's all guaranteed money. And so it's one of those things where it puts you in this spot like, oh my God, I can't believe we're going to talk about this again with Saquon, with Josh Jacobs. Like, here we go again. This discussion just picks back up a year later. What I will say is every one of these names, like the guys you list, you say to yourself, God, those guys are really important to that team. And what's so interesting about that is, to me, I would say, yeah, you got to tag him if you can't get deals done. If you can't get a deal done with Jalen Johnson, you're the Bears, tag him because you got to keep him. He's too important to the growth of where you're headed. If you're the Bengals, Joe Burrow healthy next year, you got to find a way to get T. Higgins back in a Bengals uniform. Like, it is really, really important. Unless you can guarantee you're going to get drafted wide receiver high because you have a higher pick. You know what I mean? Like, but even then, that's risky. It's just because T. Higgins is that guy. He's a bona fide number one behind one of the top 3 receivers in the league. I mean, that receiving core is just nasty when healthy, him and Chase. Michael Pittman, surprise. That was a little bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah.
You have your basically rookie quarterback starting this year. Like, you've got to find a way to bring him into camp and have Michael Pittman there. Probably also need to draft another weapon as well for Richardson, but you've got to find a way to bring Pittman back. So this will be a tense next couple week and a half as these guys deal with figuring it all out. Baker Mayfield, he's a guy that I feel like if you can't get a deal done, would you throw the tag on him? It's a lot of the quarterback tag is very, very high. But it's like you're not tied to him long term. So it's not the worst thing in the world if you're the Bucs to throw the tag on Baker. So he's a guy I could be convinced, throw the tag on him. Just like lock him down for a year, pay him a big chunk of money for next year. I don't know. We'd have to look at Tampa's cap situation because they have some veterans who they got to pay and figure out, why bring Baker back if you're not bringing Mike Evans back? There's some things like that. So, this list is always fascinating and it's always interesting because most of the time these dudes are really important players to the teams or the guys who are even being considered for that tag.
Yeah, no, it's a very important time of the year for these teams to shape how they're going to be building their roster. And, a lot of times too, the benefit to this is you're signaling a gaping, hole in your defense or your offense, and you're signaling to the rest of the league, this is now a position of target for the draft. And so maybe when it comes to trade talks for the draft and moving up and back, you're giving teams a little bit more intel here. By saying, well, shoot, we lost Jalen Johnson. Now we desperately need a corner. And so if we're trying to make deals to get into the first round or second round, they're going to probably know who you're going for in that aspect. So that could be another kind of mind game that these teams have to play.
It's a great point, but I also think one of the things, and it's really underrated, but we talk about it a lot. I talk about it a lot. You have a really good franchise with a history of winning and stability. But what a good franchises with a history of winning and stability do. They homegrown players that are stars, they keep them and they groom them. And if they don't fit your timeline, it doesn't matter. Like we talked about it all the time with Jacksonville after they made that AFC Championship game. And then like a year later, they're letting go of Jalen Ramsey because he was unhappy. It's like, well, listen, you've got to find a way for for bad franchises to keep good homegrown talent. Cody Whitehair and Eddie Eddie Jackson for the Bears. They just let 2 players go who are Hall of Very good Chicago Bears players, Cody Whitehair and Eddie Jackson. Both made Pro Bowls at times. Both were a really crucial part of that 2018 playoff run and the 2020 playoff run. And it sucks that when their prime was in their prime, the team wasn't better. But, like, if you see it, they both just had 7-8 years with the team, and I'm comfortable now letting them go. Jalen Johnson's a guy that if he leaves and walks away, then you got to spend a ton of money or resources in the draft or free agency going to get a Jalen Johnson-type player. So just don't let him go. Like, find a way to make it work. Find a way to make it work. Like, those are the things. When you look at a Michael Pittman, you say to yourself, well, Mark, you got Malik Neighbors, you got all these wide receivers in the draft. No. He's a star wide receiver, and he's already in your organization. He's in his prime. Find a way to make it work. Keep him in.
And having multiple star receivers is, almost a must at times.
It's the same thing with the Bengals. Like the Bengals, well, you could argue they have Chase. It's a luxury to have T. Higgins. You could go draft wide receiver. But listen, right now, you're the only proven team in the NFL that has beaten Patrick Mahomes in his prime on the road to get to Super Bowl. With those guys. So how do you not try to bring them back? And let's be honest, T. Higgins has been healthier and in a lot of ways more reliable than Chase, even though Chase is the star and he's the better player.
Yeah.
Now, then you have teams like a Saquon Barkley where you're like, well, man, it almost like do the player the favor. He's only got about 2 years left maybe to really be a star difference maker, and you're nowhere near that. But then you say to yourself, well, we need to try to put a competitive team on the field, so you're in that weird, kind of transition spot. So it'll be interesting to see how these teams do it and where the franchise tags last. But yeah, it's a reminder to me of, like, if you're homegrown talent, you should want to keep your good homegrown talent. Problem is, some of them with Saquon Barkley, it's like, well, they're past their prime, and our window's just not lining up at all.
Yeah,
then you have versus the situations like a Bears situation. Oh, it's lining up, and he's in his prime. Well, if that means you got to bring back the Brinks up truck a little bit, so be it. If that's what you got to do, so be it.
Yeah, and there are other teams that are just in win now mode, and it would be killer to lose a significant part. I mean, Christian Wilkins comes to mind there with Miami, although I don't know if they're going to have the money to really afford him. But he's a great component of what their defense does, and they don't have a knock your socks off defense currently.
Schefter retweeted that tweet because a lot of people were saying, you left off Chris Jones. And he even replied to his own tweet. He's like, whoa. Chris Jones, yes. Could he get tagged? But because of the way his lined up, they would need to pay him like $30-something million guaranteed in the tag. Yeah. So he's like, they're not going to tag him. Like,
no, he would have to get a long-term extension done.
It's really important to get Chris Jones re-signed, but he's not really. There are certain players, because of the way their contracts lined up, yes, could they get tagged? But the money would be so exponential that they're not a candidate for the tag. They're a candidate for, getting the deal done or whatever it might be. So yeah, exactly. We're entering the next Monday on the show. We may have some answers to what some teams are doing. And then you have the stories of, will those guys hold out? What will they do? Blah, 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 this, blah, 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 that. A lot of times the tag is a way to hold a guy so you can have more time to work the deal. And, even though it's a bad PR look, the guy will come out and say, I'm not playing on the tag. I want to be traded now. We're going to be dealing with those storylines the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. It's kind of like what we just recently saw with Jonathan Taylor as well, where they've finally ended up getting the long-term extension done that he was looking for. And
his money now will help the franchise tag for these running backs.
It will, yes,
because that's good big money, and that's going to impact. I guarantee that the tag number for the running backs is higher this year than it was last year because of that.
I wonder if we see Baker Mayfield at the end of his career saying, wow, he really took like a Kirk Cousins trajectory. And if he does get tagged and just like making great financial deals because you're too good of a quarterback to like just dismiss as a backup in the league, but never like great enough to get like the long-term,
10-year deal,
$200 million deals or whatever. But I mean, Kirk has put together a nice career for himself. And, some could argue with Baker's year this past year, if he stacks those types of years, I mean, it'll very much be similar to a Kirk Cousins production.
It's a great point, and I would add to this. Remember, Baker turned down that year before he got injured. He turned down 5 years, 130 mil, 140 mil, and it was like but it was because it was only 100 mil guaranteed, which at that time was like the last kind of transition year, but guys were already getting now like 150, 160, 170 guaranteed, like Josh Allen. Mahomes already got that big guarantees, where he was looking for that. And yet his contract, because that contract looked more like what they got 2 or 3 years ago for guys like Wentz and Jared Goff, where it's like, damn, that's big money. But he was in that kind of weird transition year right before COVID and all these things where it was seemed as disrespectful. He would kill for that money now, because Baker really, to this point, he did a lot of ads his rookie year and second year. He had made good money as a number 1 overall pick, but realistically, in the world of the hierarchy of quarterbacks, he's not made nearly what a lot of other guys will make. So, tag where he's going to get 35 plus guaranteed, I think him and his camp would happily sign a franchise tag, wouldn't complain too much, while also saying, let's try to work a deal here. Maybe we can work a deal. But if you're Tampa, why not tag him this year? If it goes just as well next year, tag him again. Don't be on the hook for Baker Mayfield, because you just saw that contract move that the Seahawks did with Geno, and it was kind of like a good guy move where they picked up that where they probably shouldn't have, but they did pick it up, so it guarantees he's going to get that money. But yeah, you could end up being in that spot where you have to do the good guy move, as opposed just if you pay him the tag this year and he has a down year next year and he stinks, you go draft a quarterback and say it was a fun 2-year run with Baker, and in the end we got 2 years of basically like $40 million, and that was it.
And he could still make his money afterwards too. I mean, that's the benefit of a quarterback, is the franchise tag isn't the end all be all. If you got injured, for instance, you're still making that money, and you can come next year and your market won't really be that affected.
Yeah, depending on how good or bad he was.
Sure, yeah.
And the injury.
So but if you have if you tear your ACL as a quarterback, you can come back from that easily, especially if you're one that's not running the football all the time. Whereas if you tear your ACL as Saquon Barkley on your franchise tag year, well, you're not going to make any money the year after that.
You're done.
People are worried about it. They're not going to
sell those chains now and start investing. You know what I mean?
Exactly. So it's not a one size fits all across the league for positions.
It's a great point. And my final thing on that would just be, you're right, for Baker, he's really, especially how mature he was at the end of the year and how he handled it and how he played. He's a guy that even if he has a slightly down year or gets injured next year, and then the Bucs said to move on, he's the prime candidate for, if we draft a rookie quarterback in the top 10 and we don't want to start him right away, let's go sign Baker. Baker can tell this guy, hey, I went through it. I was a star. Let me start the first 5 games. And those are good money contracts. You know what I mean? If you're smart about the way you put your money, you'll still be very, very set for life, especially after all that tag money he'd get this year. But I do expect Baker and the Bucs to sign a Geno Smith-esque deal or better. And so we'll keep an eye out, but that's the headlines here the next couple weeks.
Absolutely. So as we alluded to early on, the football season may be over, but the football content certainly is not dry. We've got plenty coming through over the next couple weeks for those tags. We've got draft prep end of the month in like a week plus. We've got the NFL Combine and some great shows on the way here as we get into the new league year and all of that stuff, plus some special guests coming up this year as well. So want to tease to that too, because we'll have some fun, exciting shows here to kind of bring in some different perspectives and information as to this time of year. So be on the lookout for that. Not gonna put anything out there just yet, but that's enough of a teaser for everyone now. We appreciate you listening. As always, we are at FB Lounge Pod on pretty much every major social media platform. Go give us a like, subscribe on YouTube as well. Really helps us out with the algorithm there. Appreciate the viewership, and we will be back here next week.